Hey guys, I wanted to do a video today addressing both a couple questions that I see asked a lot when I'm doing my own reading and research and just hobby stuff with headphones, but also just address what I think might be some misconceptions that have been created over the years because of the characteristics some higher headphones have in their sound signature and what that's led people to think about what is high quality, what isn't, etc. I wouldn't necessarily call myself an audiophile, but I certainly would describe myself as somebody who, for as long as I can remember, has been an enthusiast of stereo equipment, and certainly have some fairly nice headphones and do an exhaustive amount of reading on all this stuff to try to stay up on it, just to, I don't know, it's a fun thing to play around with. So something that I've really noticed as I've kind of gone on my own journey playing with audio equipment over the years is that a lot of times audiophile headphones are described as being very neutral sounding, and you probably hear that word a lot, and that sort of, it makes sense in a way, but in a way I think it doesn't. You'll see headphones that are often aimed at mixing professionals. I know that the biodynamic DT770s, for instance, were originally created for sound engineers and people like that needed to hear a pretty balanced mix, so that while they were working in the recording studio or mastering things that had been recorded, they can get a pretty accurate representation of levels and make sure that what they're engineering for the CD is going to end up sounding balanced and not very skewed and lopsided. And so for headphones like that, it's important to have a fairly neutral and evenly represented sound signature. And I think that ends up creating a misconception along the way that just because I would say the DT770s are fairly high-end headphones at their price point, it could lead people to think, well, that's what being high-end means. You have to be neutral, and anything that is not neutral is therefore low quality or it's bad. And that's not necessarily true either. Particularly if you're a music enthusiast and not somebody who does it for a living, it's fine to prefer different emphasis at different frequency ranges. I mean, these Denon AHD 5000s I've had for probably 11 or 12 years have been some of my favorite headphones to listen to for a long time. And these are certainly not neutral headphones. They have a fairly bright high end and they have a very robust low end. The bass on them is very powerful, very thick. These, at the time when I got them, coming from a background of listening to big floor standing speakers with decent sized woofers in them, or even occasionally having subwoofers in the house or in the car, these, when I first got them, were the closest I'd ever heard to that kind of depth in a headphone. Now, I want to also clarify, anytime I say I'm used to having subwoofers, people probably think of like the huge booming trunks driving, in cars driving down the street, and are like, I don't want that in my music, it's too boomy, it's too whatever. I want to clarify, that's not what it has to mean when you have a subwoofer. People that have subwoofers for their home theater, either for movies or for music, that's often just to complement the lack of their regular speakers' ability to do the low end well. You can have clean, very tight and punchy bass that sounds good and really rounds out everything you're listening to without it being muddy and terrible. I think that's another misconception that gets thrown around, is that if something has good bass, it necessarily means muddy and low quality, and the two don't have to have anything to do with each other at all. And certainly that was my experience with the Denon headphones, is they had that really like robust bass and excellent detail throughout the rest of the music that was very enjoyable to listen to. I am someone who likes bass in their music, and so for me, if I listen to a pair of headphones where the bass to me sounds very weak, somebody else might describe that as very neutral or very honest or clinical or whatever word they want to attach to it. AKG headphones, for instance, years ago I tried the K701s, I believe was the model. Those were headphones that at the time a ton of people had praised for being spectacularly detailed and having a really wide soundstage, and I would agree with that from my memory of them from years ago. But what I just personally couldn't get past with them is there was so much emphasis on the mids and the highs and the detail there, I felt like the bass got very lost. And as somebody who likes an ample amount of bass, they just did not sound fun to me. It made everything I was listening to sound clinical. I think that would be the word I would use for it. That's nothing against people who prefer that kind of sound, and to each their own, but for me, that made them unfun to listen to music on, and it just, you know, when you have multiple pairs of headphones at any given listening session, you're deciding which one of them do I feel like putting on today. You find when you're like me, those would never be the headphones you would pick, and after a while you're like, why do I even own these then? And so I tend to prefer headphones that either have automatically, you know, some kind of scaled up bass, or like the DT 1990s, the bass on them out of the box is solid, but I even have used EQ when listening to them from my computer with a Sound Blaster X G6 sound card. I do EQ them a little bit, and sometimes I punch up the bass a little bit on these. The driver in them is excellent. It can play very deep, and it can take it with the EQ. You know, some headphones you're kind of reluctant to turn the bass up because there could be distortion, or you could make the cone angry. Headphones like this can certainly take it, and they'll give you the bass if you ask for more. But speaking of EQ, I think that's another thing to mention is what I've seen in a lot of discussions and forums and things like that is a lot of audiophile purists will kind of turn their nose up at the idea of using EQ. Like they think that the only right way to listen to music is exactly the way it comes off of the CD with zero anything altering that, and that any deviation from that is wrong or somehow you're not doing it right. And that's another, to each your own. I mean, if that's how you prefer to listen to music, cool. But I would kind of warn against poo-pooing other people for doing it differently. And if you're someone watching this who's kind of getting into audio for the first time or trying to learn more, I guess my advice to you would be don't let that kind of talk discourage you from, you know, getting into it more if you want. Yes, the way that some EQs work, it is technically a form of dynamic compression, which can narrow the dynamic range, which is the difference between the quietest and loudest parts of what you're listening to, and audiophiles tend to really bristle at anything that reduces dynamic range. It's understandable to a point, but again, to me, I'm like, on any headphones, particularly when you've gotten up to the point where, you know, you're listening to something that costs $500 or $600, if you've paid that kind of money for headphones, I mean, you ought to enjoy it. It ought to be fun every time you put them on. And like for me with these 1990s, they don't sound bad at a neutral EQ. It's not like I put them on and I'm like, oh man. But if I give them, you know, 3 to 5 extra decibels of bass at certain frequencies, it turns good headphones into something that you like are nodding your head to and you're tapping your foot to, and it's an amazing experience. Why wouldn't you want that? I remember when I was reading about the Sound Blaster G6 that I own before I got it, and when I was doing research, a lot of people were talking about the mode you can put it in, direct mode, that bypasses all of the digital signal processing and everything and gives you like a pure, unadulterated signal through the DAC, which a lot of people were describing as like, this is a must. Ignore everything else the sound card can do. You have to listen to it this way. My biggest challenge with that, even if I agree with that maybe a little bit philosophically, is on that the software for that sound card, you can't use any EQ in direct mode. And so I end up just, it insists in the software, for instance, that you have, if you don't have direct mode on, you have to use one of Sound Blaster's processing things. So I just put it on the crystallizer and turn the effect all the way down to 0 to humor it. Now it's technically using one of them, but it's not really using it. To give me a pretty close to unchanged sound, but I have access to an EQ to make a couple fine adjustments. To me, that improves the headphone experience. I would disagree that that is somehow ruining the purity of listening to music. Some people can get carried away with that kind of thing. And so I guess what I'm really saying, you know, and similarly on these, before I switched to the Dakoni Elite pads, which as I mentioned when I reviewed those pads, did tame the highs a little bit, which is nice. But when I first tried these headphones, I had an experience that was similar to what a lot of people said, which is the highs are brilliant and tons of detail in them, but they're a little intense. And when you're listening to these for a long period of time, that can get a little fatiguing. And so for me, again, that was nice to be able to have an EQ. I could take the 8 kilohertz range and drop it 3 decibels. That helped to be able to do that. It made them a lot more comfortable to listen to. It mellowed that out a little and allowed more emphasis on the mids. I just thought that was a better experience, and to arbitrarily deny myself an EQ because of some rule that I think there is, that would just make for an objective or a subjectively worse experience with the headphones. And so again, that would be my advice to somebody starting out in this: is this hobby is all about your enjoyment of music, or don't feel pressured into doing or not doing something because somebody is telling you that you need to listen to it a certain way according to their rules on headphones. That's silly. There's no rules on how to listen to your audio equipment. Be careful putting too much stock in the way that people describe certain headphones. A good example of that is these DT770s against the V-Moda M100s. Now, I had the V-Modus first, and more recently got the 770s. But when I was first doing reading about these crossfade M100s, everybody was describing them as a very fun-sounding headphone with the V shape, meaning emphasis on bass and treble, less so in the mid-range. And they described them as a bass heads headphone. And usually when people say that, what they're talking about is somebody who loves bass so much that they want bass pretty much at the exclusion of everything else in the music. I would disagree with that sentiment about these headphones now, having tried some other things, and I'll tell you why. I guess you could call me a bass head, but I would reject the notion that just because I like really robust bass means I don't care about the rest of the sound. I absolutely do care about the rest of it. It's one of the reasons I like the 1990s so much, is because they have stellar detail and highs, despite being able to carry that low end well. Totally transforms the vocal experience, for instance, with things that you're listening to. But these are like $250 headphones at a very competitive, like 180-ish, I think these often go for, these DT770s. I actually think that the bass on the 770s is better. Better not just in terms of it's less muddy, it's tighter, but also it plays deeper. If you're listening to like R&B or some electronic music that has those really low notes, there are quite a few songs that when I listen to it, even off of a good headphone amp on these M100s, it bottoms out. You don't really hear, like the bass is solid to a certain point, and then when it drops to that really low note, you can only like kind of hear it. Whereas when I listen to it on these, that note is steady, it's consistent with the rest of the bass. And so for me, I'm like, I don't know that I would describe these as a bass heads headphone, because they're muddier and it doesn't play as deep. And if you really are a bass head and you're into like that subwoofer range of bass, these actually aren't as good for that at all. And they're like $80 more expensive than the DT770. So the M100s are certainly more portable, but if I were going into this now doing it all again, I would find it a little misleading, knowing what I know, that everyone is calling these bass head headphones and not these, when actually I think if you were a bass head choosing between these two headphones, the 770s would be a better choice for you, in my experience, even though these are used for studio work and are described as more neutral. I just find they generally have a better sound overall. And so it's useful to read reviews and get people's opinions, especially if you find somebody that you want to follow that you find in general they seem pretty honest, or their opinions fall in line with your preferences. They compare them to other headphones. That's a great way to figure out what you want to buy. If somebody does a video like this headphone versus this one, maybe you've listened to this one and you're deciding if you want this one. Well, now those comparisons are really worthwhile because you have something to base that off of, instead of just somebody telling you these are great, get them. That was largely what caused me to get the AKG 701s back in the day. It was everywhere I went, I was reading all these reviews of people saying these headphones are the best thing ever, blah blah blah. And so I got them, and I would take nothing away from their detail and their soundstage. It was excellent, but for me, people hadn't, at the time, with what I had read about them, hadn't stressed enough the neutrality of the bass. That made for a very unengaging experience for me. Now, luckily, I was able to sell them used for pretty close to what I paid for them and turn around and have to invest very little new money to buy these Denons. These were what I got right after the AKGs. And for me, that was a real breath of fresh air because the Denons seemed like they largely were comparable in detail and not quite as good of a soundstage, but definitely the best soundstage I had heard at the time for a closed back headphone. And it had all the bass that I was missing with the AKGs and without any EQ. And the first time I put these on, I was like, yes, this was the right purchase. This is what I'm looking for. And it was like the opposite of buyer's remorse. Like I had never auditioned them. I had never listened to them. I just ordered them on Amazon like 10 years ago. So whenever you do that, you're pretty like, I hope this was a good decision. And the first time I listened to them, it was like, yes, I'm glad I got those. This is what I'm looking for. I do use a dedicated headphone amp at my desk to listen to all of these headphones, but I try to approach it with a degree of like, let's not get carried away, or let's not. I'll say that years ago I was really into some of the headphone forums and I was trying to learn from a lot of these self-called audiophiles, and it's not to say that they didn't occasionally have really good advice that I did learn some things from, but for me, in case this is helpful to you as a cautionary tale, like warning you away from this, I ruined the fun of listening to music for myself for a while because I was reading so many things about you have to have this DAC and you have to have this headphone amp and you have to have this special cord and you have to not use EQ and you have to all this other stuff, and it was always being described as like anything short of all of that was garbage and you were a joke if you called yourself an audio enthusiast not doing all that stuff. And then it started making me neurotic about it to the point that like at the time I didn't have a headphone amp, and so since someone told me you can't enjoy headphones like this without a headphone amp, and because I was told that, it gave me this weird bias every time I listened to them where, you know, it was like yesterday they were great headphones, but now that I read that someone said they can't be great headphones without an amp, now when I plug them in, I'm like, man, they don't sound good enough, and now the music isn't fun anymore, and then you find yourself so obsessed with wishing that you could get better equipment to enjoy the stuff that somewhere along the way you forget, hey, listening to music is supposed to be fun. I forgot that. Like, can I just give myself a break here and go back to just listening to music and having a good time? And so at the end of the day, that's really what this whole hobby, I think, should be about. And so be leery of listening to opinions or reading stuff that's going to end up taking that away for you. There's certainly reasons to have headphone amps and there's legitimacy to all of that, but you know, if you have been plugging your DT770s into your phone and it sounds good to you and you're really glad that you bought them, then don't worry about it when somebody else says, oh my God, I couldn't imagine plugging those into my phone. That's garbage. Whatever. If it's good to your ears, you know, leave it be. So anyway, I don't want to ramble on forever about this, but I hope that's useful perspective for somebody like just getting into this game, or if you've been feeling kind of what I've described feeling at one point where like reading all these opinions has made you kind of frustrated about the stuff that you're getting. I hope that helps you. If you have questions or stuff you'd like me to address in, say, another video, as always, leave them in the comments below. Otherwise, thanks for watching, guys.